grow, especially with the youth. Um, and it's really scary because they're really angry right now.
Jerry?
Yeah, I wanted to talk to Ernest. Well, first of all, wanted to remind everybody that you're on Rolling Out News Live, and we're with photographer Negacia Jackson, who lives in Minneapolis. We're also with Ernest Cohen. Just wanted you to introduce yourself right quick and just tell us about a little bit about who you are and why you're in this situation right now, sir.
So I'm the associate director for the African American Leadership Forum, and our organization really exists to convene, collaborate, and champion leaders throughout the Twin Cities community and for the Black community here. What puts me in this position is really just being connected to the network of leaders who are taking action. And I'm in this spot where I'm encouraged to see so many people taking swift action. I'm encouraged to see so many people on fire and ready to leverage the catalyst of this moment. And at the same time, I'm in this position where I'm trying to understand how to make our leadership throughout our community focus on the importance of collectivism, focus on the importance of, while we lean into the anger that we have because it's powerful, because there's strength in anger, there's strength in frustration, and we need to leverage it. While we do that, we also need to engage one another and make sure that the work that's happening that's already effective, the folks that have already been on the front lines, who have been passing out masks on the street, who have been actively engaging with the political background of what's going on in this COVID-19 crisis, and making sure that the folks who have already been engaged with conversations with the police departments, engaged with conversations with city council and mayors and what have you, that we're not discounting the efforts of those people that have been active up until this point, simply to start something anew. There's some energy I'm seeing that's building up for that because of that frustration. And that's the biggest concern, that we would walk away from what relationships have been built, what progress has been made for the sake of starting something new that has not built the established relationship, the established connection to the existing systems, so that we can have the impact that we want to make, right? And so we are constantly pushing folks to, yes, lean into the anger, frustration, everything, the passion that you feel in this moment, lean into it, and lean into your tribe, right? Your tribe has been active. We haven't been resting on our laurels up until today. We've seen these moments come and go. We've seen these situations before. And there are a number of people who have been active at this level, who recognize what's happening now, what will come to pass. And we can be prepared for that if we stay connected, if we stay engaged with one another, if we have true, real, heartfelt conversations that get us to the root of what it is that we're trying to achieve as a collective, not individually. Not do this because I said so, not I'm a gatekeeper and you can't handle this because I've been here longer than you have, but because these are the established relationships that exist. These are the pipelines for effective change. This is the landscape that I've learned how to navigate. Let me coach you through that work, and bring your innovation, bring your frustration, so that when we come into those spaces, we're not being as polite as they expect us to be, that we're being as forceful as we need to be, so that the change that needs to come does come.
Negacia?
Yes.
So in listening to can I call you Ernest?
Yes, sir.
When listening to Ernest says that we want to continue to create the collaboration and coalescing of the current leadership in the urban community. Why do you think there are others that really want to circumvent? I'm not even going to say that they're building something new, because it takes a long time to build something. Circumvent this based on frustrations, because we know in most movements, the violence will distract from the truth.
So I know at 38th in Chicago, a lot of the youth were there. There's a division amongst the older leadership and the youth, because the youth said they feel like the older leadership are not bringing them to the table, not having them a part of the conversation. So everything is one-sided. So it's a real division between the youth and the older generation because they feel like they're not brought to the table and things are not done cohesively because at the protest at the police station, the youth took over. I mean, they took over and started speaking, and then started
You might be entering into a dead zone, Miss Jackson, but yeah, hang in there with us.
Was that your experience, Ernest, as well?
It's been a long road. It's been a long road. Our organization really exists to address that issue. It's one of the things that we've seen happen throughout our community and throughout the legacy of the work that we do. That you know, the folks who
there
have
has
been
for the youth and the older generation to come together and sit at the table and have a conversation so things can be done differently. Because with the things that are happening right now,
Bless her heart. I mean, she's on the front line. She's taking pictures and she's trying to talk to us at the same time. So bless her heart. Gosh, Miss Jackson, we got you. Try to come back if you can.
It's from an outsider looking in, you guys got super issues. Because oftentimes the experience that we've had in your city, you don't at that point have stakeholders who aren't vested. So many of the stakeholders are vested in the city and they're vested in the system. So I think that I think you have, everybody says time to wait to change. And I obviously the change needs to happen now. And I know that we've attended several of the meetings there in Minneapolis, and the wait and see and very philosophical approach to make change in Minneapolis seems polarizing in a strategy when there are often not African American decision makers at all. So is that your experience as well?
to a degree. I think there's some truth in that. I think what I've seen is that there are a number of people who, to your point, have that vested interest in the systems that exist, who've made the effort to build a career in those spaces so that they can affect change from the inside. And you know, we've seen these situations where those folks who take the time and energy to build a career in that space struggle to establish and maintain the relationships in community that they came up with. And so that's one of the greatest tragedies of that effort, as folks try to make that change internally, that they lose the connection to community that they had in the first place, despite the fact that their intentions are pure. You know what they say about good intentions.
Pure and
So
profit in the same sentence. You
I'm
putting
sorry,
you putting pure and profit in the same sentence, or you putting pure
not profit,
no,
not profit, no, pure intent.
right. But I'm just saying, if they're working at the establishment, it makes it very difficult for them to be open and to bring. And the other thing is when their numbers are small, like just from the beginning, when they report in and don't have a true relationship, even the Black media in your town, when you consider that the advertising of in the Statesman, it's not filled, and you've got 20 of the biggest national corporations in the country. I mean, I think it speaks to their commitment to covering the community, committed to preserving the culture. They have every rationale why not, and yet they spend money everywhere else on a stadium. So I think the truth may not even be able to be from somebody internal in terms of evaluating how we bring forward change from our experience being in Minneapolis. Because I think what do you have expectations, both Ernest and Negasha, of the Fortune 500 corporations that say they want diversity to come, but why would Black people move when y'all have black killing season, it appears.
Mm. Mm. It's heavy. It's heavy.
I mean, it's like y'all have deer season. Now y'all have this season, and everybody's wearing a badge. So that I'm at least what I'm saying. I'm like,
I hear you.
brother to brother. Oh, okay. North Minneapolis is a fight, but the motto of your police department is something very different. What's the motto of the police department, Terry?
Well, I mean, the motto of the police department.
Yeah, no, they've got a motto.
Protect and serve.
No, it's serve with compassion.
Well, that too.
Courage
that
and
too.
compassion. Did
That
we
too.
see any compassion when it came to the policing of George Floyd, Ernest?
Yeah, not visible. Not visible at all, and unacceptable. The circumstance that we saw is inexplicable. And I think that's the reason we're seeing the reaction that we have. And to the point that was made earlier about, violence getting in the way of truth, we need to be careful that, the work that we are doing that's ongoing to make sure that the terrible actions that take place at the hands of the police departments in our communities cease. Those efforts need to be bolstered. Those efforts need to be reinforced. Those efforts need to be supported and engaged and uplifted so that they can be more effective. Yeah. And the problem that we run into is that we have a segment of our community that just doesn't believe in the effort that's taken place up until this point. We have to be willing to invest in our own effort and invest in our own leadership rather than divest, disbelieve, and engage in work that's can be counterproductive.
Well, we're live rolling out news from Minneapolis. We have Ernest and Negatia, who are both on the front line. We're talking to them about the change, why it's happening. We've got violence, and it appears tear gas. We've got a youth and a community divided. Ernest, what are your hopes that we can see in the next 24 hours from Minneapolis? Because y'all are hot right now.
Yeah, man. My hope for the next 24 hours is healing, man. And healing comes in so many different ways, brother. It's there's accountability, right? And there's calling out the truth of the circumstance. And that speaks to the current circumstance as well as historically what we've seen up until this point. And then there comes to a place where we've got to lean into the value of the relationship between our young leaders, new leaders, recently established leaders, and our folks who have been at this thing for years on end. And honestly, I really appreciate the folks that you have reached out to up until this point. I heard you mention Leslie and Eli. I see Nakima jumping on the line now. Folks doing incredible stuff out in the community that's been ongoing. And for me, it would just be a shame to see new names pop up of folks who haven't been connected to that work, are unaware of the experiences that these folks has had, unaware of the effort that's been made up until this point, and simply start to do things, get active, and be counterproductive to those efforts. That's my only concern. But, really my hope in it all is healing, bro. My hope in it all is that we have leadership that is healthy, that's whole, that's thorough, doing what they need to do, and that's willing to get the job done by any means necessary.
At the same time, what would you say to the corporations there? I mean, literally, it's that moment for us in a city where it appears that the business community has to have a bigger voice in setting the tone of what's happening in your police force. I mean, that police chief's gonna need a whole lot of support from the entire city to be able to address this.
Man, listen, we got a lot of corporations out here. We have a lot of businesses who have invested in different ways throughout community. My call to action for those corporations, and this is just from a personal lens, would be to really reconsider where you're putting resources and just think about what it means to invest in community in a way that elevates the value and the importance of the safety of all the people that live here.
We have one of those individuals right now, Nikema Levy-Pound, civil rights attorney, live from Minneapolis on the front line of this movement. We want to welcome you to Rolling Out News. It is important that you bring us up to speed. We know that you're right there on the front line. We want to thank you for coming on right now.
Well, thank you for having me. I literally just made it back home from the rally and the march that we held in South Minneapolis, close to the spot where George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police. And so we marched 2.5 miles from the scene of where he was killed to the 3rd Precinct Police Station. And most of the demonstration was peaceful, but there was a small group of folks who went to the back of the police station and they were breaking windows and, doing, spray painting and things like that. I mean, I feel like, honestly, we tried our best to try to maintain an extremely large crowd, but you always have people who, make a decision that they are going to ensure that the police know that they were present. And I can't fault those young people who were engaged in those activities because, they know that someone in our community was snuffed out by law enforcement. And even though, by the grace of God, those 4 officers were fired, which never happens when they take a Black life. So that's a miracle. That's not going to bring back George Floyd. So those kids have a lot of pain and they have a lot of trauma. And eventually the police responded and they started tear gassing the crowd. You could just hear big booms and then lights flashing and people running and tear gas smoke. But the reality is that even with the tear gas, some of the young people stayed. They were still there when I left. And it just reminded me of part of my experience in Ferguson, where you could literally see the rage that people were experiencing after Mike Brown was killed. And sometimes that involved direct confrontation with law enforcement. So we've had our own situation here in Minneapolis after they killed someone, Jamar Clark, in November of 2015, where we basically occupied the 4th Precinct Police Station for 18 days in the freezing cold, in the midst of blizzards and everything. We refused to leave because we were tired of them, so cavalierly taking our lives and not being held accountable.
Terry?
Well, I wanted to go ahead and give a shout out to your Minneapolis Police Chief, I want to make sure I pronounce this right, Daria Arredondo. Yes. And so we were talking to one of the other activists, Leslie earlier, about how she was surprised that she never fathomed that the police officers would have been fired within 24 hours after this actual, killing of a unarmed and handcuffed Black man who was in the prone position and powerless already. But then, the maximum weight of 2 or 3 officers on him, just basically broke him. And so speak to us about, and Ernest, you could talk about this as well, about the importance of having not just activism, because we're not going to move beyond activism, just like we're not going to move beyond kneeling, but we're, in addition to activism, about the importance of getting into positions of power where actual change can actually take place. And we can attack this thing from a variety of standpoints.
Well, I think it's also realizing that some activists are already in a position of power. So if I look at my own life, like I'm a lawyer activist, and I used to be a law professor for 14 years, former president of the Minneapolis NAACP. And right now I'm the executive director of a small foundation that focuses on women of color activists. So I choose activism as another tool to fight for justice for our people. And if you look at Leslie Redmond, she is an attorney and she has her MBA and she's the NAACP president. and has, started her own organization. So this is, I just see this in the same vein as Dr. King, who had his PhD, but he was also an activist for justice for Black people. So I think we have to make sure we're not seeing activism as a monolith, but realizing that, there's a wide variety of folks who engage in activism. And many of us who have the credentials and who are in professional positions are making a conscious choice to put our lives and livelihood on the line to stand with our people, particularly those who don't have a seat at the table and whose voices are rarely being heard. That's where I'm the most comfortable. And that's where I feel God called me to. And, my life shifted dramatically after I went to Ferguson, Missouri. After Mike Brown was killed, I went there as a legal observer through the National Lawyers Guild. I came out as a freedom fighter, standing on the front lines as an activist. I realized I needed to get out of that ivory tower and shut stuff down, when the time became necessary as yet another tool.
We've got questions from Facebook, and they're wondering about the firing. Many want to understand what the prosecution possibilities of these officers could be, and they need insight from you. If you would share with them, please.
Yeah, so it is unusual for officers who take Black lives to be fired in the city of Minneapolis. We have had many police shootings, mostly white officers who have shot and killed African American men, and they are still on the force to this day, sometimes decades after they've killed an unarmed person. And so having a new police chief, the first African American chief in the city's history, definitely makes a difference in terms of his willingness to take a stand. And of course, he's going to face backlash from the union and folks who don't want to see a Black police chief. But he knew that it was the right thing to do. I mean, I see him as a man of integrity working inside of a very corrupt police department. In terms of whether these cops will be prosecuted, I think it will really literally be a miracle for that to happen. Our county attorney, Mike Freeman, has consistently failed to hold killer cops accountable. As a matter of fact, the only cop in recent history that has been charged and convicted of killing someone was Muhammad Noor, who shot and killed a white woman by the name of Justine Damon in 2017.
I was
And
going
I
to mention
really
that.
believe that was an actual accident. But this man was fired very swiftly. He was arrested, charged, and ultimately convicted by a jury of non-peers. And out of all of the police involved shootings over the years, not a single white officer has been held accountable. But we will push for them to be charged and for them to be convicted. It's definitely an uphill battle, but I think that it's one worth fighting to set a new precedence for what we expect to happen when officers misuse their power and authority and take the lives of civilians unnecessarily.
We see this issue as well in the Ahmaud Arbery case, where district attorneys and prosecutors are choosing to look the other way systematically. This is a big civil rights issue. What can we do to really make a difference there in Minneapolis? Because most people have never visited the MSP, and y'all stay on the scale. And I was sharing with the young man, you think of deer hunting season and hunting bear. I'm not sure that they're not hunting something else there in MSP.
Mm-hmm. Well, we call the state of Minnesota the Jim Crow North. It has a false reputation for being progressive, but
That's what I heard.
Huh?
I said that's what I've heard for decades. Is that Minneapolis is the upper Midwest, very progressive, very eclectic, and that a lot of demographics are accepted there. This is what I've been told because I've never been there. And so, yeah, this is what they're feeding. This is what they're disseminating.
Exactly, but it is so false, especially when it comes to low income Black people. I mean, even if you're a middle and upper middle income Black person who has a degree and a professional background, um, if you, apply for a job, it may be very difficult, even with those credentials, to compete against similarly situated white people, because there's a lot of nepotism that we see happening as well, not to mention racial bias when it comes to hiring. And so people need to realize that the Minnesota's reputation for being progressive is a false reputation. But beyond that, we need to also recognize that a progressive agenda is not synonymous with a racial equity agenda. Some people get that twisted. But the numbers show the truth. I mean, we consistently rank in the bottom for key indicators of quality of life for Black people. And we have consistently ranked in the top two as being the worst place in the country for African Americans to live. So that should
Wow.
signal to people some of the oppression that we experience here on a consistent basis across various systems. But people are in denial that they are racist and that they are biased because they love to volunteer, they love to give money, but that has nothing to do with their heart when it comes to how they treat their Black and brown brothers and sisters.
That's interesting. I mean, we're being educated today by you, Ms. Armstrong, and also Leslie
Well, it
about the,
appears to be and I was sharing with Ernest, it appears to be the day though, because when you think of how they treat the current African American papers that are there in your state with advertising, given the large number of Fortune 100 companies that you have in that town, it's pretty sad. And just thinking of that, what role can we ask and what companies would you ask to get involved in making change, real change?
It's hard to believe that companies will take seriously change that goes beyond the superficial level. We have some of the highest numbers of Fortune 500 companies in the country right here in Minnesota. And they do give a lot to philanthropy. I mean, we call ourselves the land of 10,000 lakes, but we're also the land of 10,000 nonprofit organizations. Most of those organizations are not Black led. Most of them are run by white people who oversaturate poor Black communities with services and not with economic opportunity, like being able to actually support Black owned businesses so they can create jobs and keep the Black dollar in the community. So there has not been a significant commitment by the businesses here to really listen at the grassroots level to Black people about what they need, or even at the professional level about how we can create jobs and build a more solid economy for our communities. Um, I don't know what the solution is other than people finding ways to launch their own large businesses and establish their own networks, because so much of our intellectual capital as educated Black people goes to large white companies that don't necessarily give back to our community.
well, yeah,
So that's on us,
it's
to do
got,
something different.
yeah, it gets diluted. It gets very diluted, and it's not concentrated as it is at per se, more concentrated as it is, like say in Atlanta or suburban Washington D.C. or Ladera Heights in Los Angeles, where there's a high concentration of Black intellectual wealth and as well as financial wealth that you can actually, it's visible and it's.
I think that the other thing is not disagreeing with Brother Shropshire, but they got the one-isms over there real bad. Like they tend to have one African American in a decision, and he could almost or she could almost make a decision, and she has a very homogenized opinion about the coming together. So it tends to be one, and then they're outnumbered by the time, even if they're at the top with the staff. So then the decisions all of a sudden turn into something else other than to, okay, right now we really have a Black problem. Like to me, that's something that I think when you guys are moving forward to really call into play. And I mean, we don't have to discuss everything now, but if you're gonna make it MSP, then you really gotta have the people that I'm looking at right here. So that if you're gonna invite brothers, because see, I'm gonna make a decision. I'm gonna say, is this real? Because I live in Atlanta. So I can ask 5 council people right now what's going on. I don't have to ask, I can ask my mayor, but I can also know who I can talk to at these corporations and have enough brothers and sisters that are making decisions.
Yeah.
And there's more than one, and there's more than two. They can make budgetary decisions. I think those are the other things, because at the welcome mat for all the young brothers that are going to come and people that I know have come and gone, they just look at it and say, man, can you say?
It's tough. It's yeah, to your point about, you know, the land of 10,000 nonprofit organizations, you know, if you're familiar with the prison industrial complex, we also have the nonprofit industrial complex. And there's circumstance where you have an industry that exists where communities of color are being served, Black people are being served, and they have the opportunity to provide direct service, but far too often don't have the opportunity to step into leadership in those same organizations. And so we are collectively and systematically kept with a ceiling that's far below what our capacity for is, what our competence level is, and certainly far below what we have the ability to achieve. The challenge there is that when the opportunities feel so few and far between, when you come from a deficit mindset, when you come from an experience that, or with a lack of exposure to opportunities beyond what you see in front of you, it becomes very, very difficult to even imagine what it looks like to step into leadership in a way that can be successful, right? And so when you see a Nakima, when you see a Leslie who have stepped into leadership in their roles, they seem like such an anomaly. They seem like they've achieved something, they've achieved the unachievable rather than being the standard of expectation, right? Like there's plenty of us. There's plenty of us in our community. The talent is there. The insight is there. The knowledge is there.
Yeah, I believe in the talent, but I think we need attorney Nakima Leslie Armstrong to actually, though, increase a percentage, because what I think we're fighting against is a real deficit to even bring an invitation, brother. I love you, but I definitely don't want to go to a place where they could mistakenly walk up to my car, and I know that my wife carries and we carried, and all of a sudden we got a problem, and y'all calling her. You know, I think there's a logical part about African Americans at this point, but we're not going to volunteer to come to a state already cold. I mean, that y'all cold is like freezing. And I said cold, y'all don't do cold, freezing. When you think about it, and I'm sitting there, this brother's on the ground, it's probably 40 degrees. Like, you know, it wasn't even a hot day. And all of a sudden you got there. So when you do that, I think y'all got to get numbers, because the workforce there has too many onesie, twosies, 30-year existing relationships. So they swap people out. Everywhere they swap the person. Well, he was over here and he was cool at this big corporation, so then she's over at that corporation. Or they get somebody that's really not from our community, but begins to appear to look like they from our community, and it looks good, but they're not all the way rooted with the people that are going to get that assistance from those nonprofits. So I think what I'm sharing is you've got to come up with a number, because the longer you have the onesie, twosy African Americans in position, they're threatened already.
Well, and many don't have a mindset of consciousness when it comes to standing up for Black people, which is unfortunate, right? I think that some people don't want to take the risk. And a lot of times, like Leslie and I can feel isolated amongst professional Black people because we're activists. Like somehow by association, Black people are going to have to go to their jobs and they're going to have to explain, why are you friends with Nakima when they just went and shut down a police station or a freeway or whatever, you know? And the fear, the risk, just the, you know, how people want to be safe. And a lot of times these companies hire safe people, and it makes it difficult when they need to stick their neck out for the next African American or to push for a pipeline program, and they won't do it because they're trying to protect their own position. So we see a lot of that going on here that makes it difficult for doors to open for, you know, people to get into those positions and then bring other people along, you know. And I think it's really sad that that happens, but part of it is just the climate and the conditioning. A lot of Black people here are transplants from other states who come here specifically to work at one of the Fortune 500 companies. And then after a period of time, they usually leave and go somewhere else. And our Black community that's native to Minnesota, you know, they have their deep roots, and sometimes they can be disconnected from Black people who are poor and coming from other parts of the country. So we have a huge, like, eclectic mix of Black folks. So those Black folks who are poor, who come from Chicago, Detroit, and Indianapolis, are looked down upon by our native Black population. And then when you combine that with our low quality of education for Black people, it makes it hard for us to have our homegrown business leaders, you know, that are educated here and that are able to help build institutions within our community. So Leslie and I are not from here. You know, I'm originally from Mississippi, grew up in LA, and Leslie is from Washington, D.C. So we came with a different concept of what it means to be Black, to celebrate Blackness, to stand up for Blackness, to speak truth to power. And that's what people see manifested in the way that we conduct ourselves as lawyers and activists and all the other titles.
Yeah.
You
See,
know,
me, I'm a Midwest kid. My father's family is from South Bend, Indiana, and my mother's side of the family, we're 4 generations deep in St. Paul, Minnesota. And so, like, the things that I've seen over time and over generations is, you know, some of the similar circumstances where youth come up and they can't build relationships that they would like to see with folks that are in positions of power and authority and influence and affluence. And so right now, the work that I do focuses really on building the relationship between folks who have been established in their careers, because so often we see the onesie twosie, right? But if we can build a nucleus, a network of folks who have established a strong relationship, they become a tribe, right? If we have torchbearers in community who have been active in this work and they can speak to what they've learned, they can speak to the path that they've taken and give insight to folks who are moving into becoming the new era of leadership, then we have an opportunity to leverage the insight, right? The historical knowledge, and build on that, build on the effort that's already been baked into the work that needs to happen, and come up with something that can be innovative, leveraging the energy and the frustration of our youth, leveraging the energy and the frustration of folks who have been in this work for so long, and at the same time using the energy of fresh eyes, whether you've been here for a while and you're just getting exposure to this work, or you're coming from another city or state and you want to participate in what you see is a possibility for the local community.
well, we're on Rolling Out News. This is coming live from Minneapolis with Ernest and Nakia Levy Armstrong. But I want us to kind of walk back through this case. All of a sudden, we have a young man, George Floyd. Why, Nakia? Why was he actually pulled over? Why did this happen in front of what, a Whole Foods, a Club Foods?
Cup Food, CUP.
Club Food.
So it's like a kind of like a corner store in South Minneapolis. And from my understanding, this started as some kind of financial transaction inside of Cup Foods. The police are alleging there was some kind of forgery or something. They weren't specific in terms of what that transaction looked like. So this was, from my understanding, a low-income Black man and had some kind of issue with the financial transaction in the store. They called the police. And once the police came, that's essentially how things escalated. They claimed in their press release that Mr. Floyd was sitting on his car, and they claimed he looked intoxicated. So they're already trying to build a case against him, because then you have an alleged forgery, him looking intoxicated, him resisting. Like they pretty much threw in everything but the kitchen sink to try to come up with something to justify his death.
But that's part of the play. That's part of the playbook. Character assassination post death.
Absolutely,
because
do it time.
Yeah.
And tried it here with this situation, and so essentially, I believe that they didn't see the value in Mr. Floyd's life. They didn't see him as being human
from the moment that they approached that man. I'm not sure if they ever saw him around the neighborhood, but it was just very clear that the man couldn't breathe and the cops didn't care. They didn't see him as a human being. That's really what led to him being killed. And it's a manifestation of the culture within MPD, which has historically oppressed and violated African Americans without any real accountability. So yes, we do have a new great Black chief, but we don't have a dramatic shift in the culture yet. So we still have a lot of folks with the mentality that they can do anything to Black bodies and get away with it. And they definitely don't want a Black man telling them what to do.
So can they receive their pension as well? If any of them qualify, can they get severance? What is the methodology that is often used in this particular type of case for these police officers?
I'm not sure what their union contract calls for in terms of them actually being fired. I mean, my guess is that they will appeal the decision, that the union will probably help them, that it may go to arbitration. We don't know if, they'll get their jobs back ultimately, which sometimes happens. Where, the arbitrator rules against the department's decision and they wind up getting their jobs back, which then qualifies them for everything. Sometimes in order to end the situation amicably, a severance package could be offered. It could be part of the negotiation process. But I don't know what the particular this union contracts say as far as whether or not they would be entitled to a pension. I certainly hope not.
Yeah, I think
no longer be on paid administrative leave pending investigation because of the decision today.
Well, I would like to know, because one of the characteristics of our movements that goes back decades is young people. And you were talking about the energy that was brought along with young people and that you tried to corral it in as much as possible. That's one of the things I would like to talk about, or to get your answer for Ernest as well as Nakima, in terms of how do we best channel and cultivate that energy into positive results that don't just result in destruction, because there's a lot of pent up anger and frustration. And if it's not channeled in the proper direction, then it leads to destruction. So I wanted to know what you guys think about channeling and harnessing that youthful exuberance.
Well, I think part of it, so most of the young people were peaceful. They weren't trying to break windows and vandalize things. They actually were using their energy to yell out chants, some of which are chants we might use expletives and say something about the police. That's still harnessing that energy and that pent up frustration, using the power of words to fight back, much like NWA did with their protest song "F the Police," right? And I know a lot of adults tried to harness their energy and shift it, but I'm thankful because they were doing some truth telling and some storytelling about the Black experience that Black adults in leadership positions refuse to talk about and refuse to use their power to actually address in South Central LA and in other parts of the nation, so that their anger and the words they spoke became the target, not the police brutality that led to the words that they spoke. So when I look at our young people, I realize that there's a spectrum of them, those who just want to be peaceful and do what they have to do, and others who are like, look, I have rage inside of me. Y'all adults keep letting this stuff happen. I don't feel safe. I have to fight back. They have that warrior instinct.
But
So
let us walk back through, because many people don't know we're on Rolling Out News. You're live in Minneapolis. They have no clue of what the last decade and almost probably 50 years in terms of what has happened to the African American community in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Well, I'll just say this, and then I want to make sure Ernest gets to say what he wants to say. I'll just say that we've had some very egregious incidences with police. After Jamar Clark was killed, a young 24-year-old young man shot in the head at point blank range by police in November of 2015. Like I said, we're out there for 18 days and we shut down that block in the police station and all of that. There were men who remembered a young man by the name of Tysell Nelson, who was just a teenager, who was shot by police. They never forgot that trauma. And these were grown men out there remembering that Tysel Nelson never got justice, right? And there's a whole bunch of other names that have come between Tysel Nelson and Jamar Clark. That's trauma people have carried and stored in their bodies and their memories, not to mention some of the economic disparities that I mentioned earlier. We also have higher rates of arrest in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities as Black people here compared to Black people in other parts of the country, as well as compared to our white counterparts. So we're like 11 times more likely to be arrested for low-level offenses than white people. We have 4 times the rate of criminal records as Black people in other states. And these things are the result of oppressive policies and laws, the fact that we're in a state that's 85% white, and the fact that we don't make the rules, not to mention we have a higher than average rate of poverty, unemployment, and underemployment. And then I talked about the education system, which is grossly inadequate when it comes to educating Black and brown boys and girls.
If you look back at the history, specifically in North Minneapolis, first, the city was established, if you look at old historical maps, it was established as a Negro district. So if you look at the size of the streets and how the actual neighborhoods are designed in that space, it's designed to be over-policed, right? And so then you go beyond that a little bit, more recent history, the building that the 4th precinct is in used to be a community recreation center, right? And so that shifts the culture, the entire dynamic of the place, right? And so now we have a space that is designed to be over-policed with an established police presence that exists in the same area that leads to a situation where we have these disparities that we talked about, and across the board. I mean, the context of education, health, job and economics, Minnesota as a state continues to be at the top of the list of all the greatest disparities in the nation, right? And so, you know, if we're not the top, we in the top 4 more often than not. The biggest concern that I have is that we don't learn from our history, that we don't learn from the circumstances that we've seen up until this point. So we have to continue to preach that gospel of understanding where we've come from and remembering what those circumstances were and leveraging that insight while also leveraging the energy and the sense of urgency that our youth bring to this space. I hear often that, you know, what do we do with the kids? What are we going to do about these kids and all their anger and frustration? That's our consequence, right? That's our consequence to deal with. So now we got to wait and see what happens, right? We created a circumstance that drove this experience. So now we get to deal with the consequence of what this experience is.
Well, you know, on Rolling Out News, I'm really trying to figure out not only that, you all are on the forefront. Minnesota is seen as this liberal paradise, and you have a young woman who is representing you that they could be tapped for the VP. Nakima, what do you think about that? This is all eyes are on Minneapolis and Minnesota as it relates to a VP pick. Would she bring that culture to the White House?
Absolutely, and it's a culture that's antithetical to having a positive Black experience in America. And we try to let people know about Amy Klobuchar's record as the Hennepin County, and the fact that she refused to hold police officers accountable who shot and killed unarmed African Americans during her tenure. And then beyond that, of course, she oversaw the prosecution of Mayan Burrell, who was just a teenager at the time that he was charged and falsely convicted for killing 11-year-old Taisha Edwards. And, you know, Amy Klobuchar used that case as part of her political capital as a stepping stone to ultimately become a senator and then to, you know, run for president. She used the case on the campaign trail. And to this day, this man is innocent, sitting in prison for a crime he did not commit. So Amy Klobuchar represents the culture that we're talking about here that does not relate well to African Americans, as you can see by, you know, her polling numbers with African American people. So we had to go to extreme measures for our voices to be heard, such as, you know, holding a press conference after the Associated Press article came out, exposing Mayan Burrell's story and Amy's role in it, to shutting all the way to shutting down her final campaign event in the state of Minnesota. And the next day she wound up withdrawing from the presidential race. We shouldn't have had to do all of that. We were simply asking for a meeting and asking her to use her political power to address Mayan's case and her role in it, and to make men advocate for this man to be free. She treated us as if we didn't matter, which is often how Black people feel in the state of Minnesota. And she had to pay a price at that time as far as, you know, getting out of the race sooner than maybe she would have liked. But for her to be considered as the VP candidate is a slap in the face to all Black people. We can't allow prosecutors to use Black bodies as a stepping stone to ascend to higher political office, and we just sit back and act like it's okay. That's been our past. That's been our history. How many slave owners have been presidents of the United States, right? That time is past. And if we had stayed silent and hadn't done anything, who knows how far she would have gone. I think that we are presenting a challenge to her being vetted as the VP right now, because these stories continue surfacing. We've been contacted by Leslie and I about Amy Klobuchar as a prospective candidate for the VP position. And we've been honest that she would be a terrible vice president because of all of these issues that we've talked about, and the fact that she has not done an adequate job of making amends, addressing these issues, and becoming a champion for criminal justice reform.
Well, this sounds very remarkably close to the situation in California, where also another vice presidential consideree, Kamala Harris, you know, we know that story very well, how she got the reputation for locking up African-American males and then leveraged that situation in order to become a prominent first attorney general and then a prominent senator. And then she's also within that, you know, that small group of people who are being considered for the vice presidency, although it's highly unlikely. So it's very interesting to see that. But I never got to ask you, Mr. Comer, in regards to what you saw tonight, and then what you saw that may have surprised you or that you did not expect to see this evening out there on the front lines.
So I didn't have a presence on the
Okay.
front line today. What I was very much surprised by was the outcome of these officers being fired. To Nakima's point, we've seen officers be fired and rehired either in the same department or in different departments. And that's certainly not a circumstance that would be acceptable. So while I am surprised at such a swift outcome, I think more importantly, what surprised me was the swiftness in which our community has responded in a clear, strong, defined way to say, this is what needs to happen now. That was it for me, just a beautiful moment to see so many different leaders throughout our community come together and quickly say they need to be fired immediately. And what's beautiful about it is that it seemed effortless, and we absolutely know that it was not, right? Because anytime our community comes together, work goes into it. Effort happens, sweat goes into it. There's always some work happening, and there's always unsung heroes behind the lines, behind the veil, who are putting in grind time to make things happen so like immediately. And so that truly inspired me. I was pleasantly surprised by that. Beyond that, it was just a beautiful show of energy and collective strength to see how many people showed up to Cup Foods. I mean, was it the news station that brought the helicopter out to show the bird's eye view?
Thousands.
Incredible. incredible.
Can you just wrap us up, if you would, attorney? I want to say this loud, attorney. I want to say it loud.
Yes,
attorney.
indeed.
You
Yes,
know,
indeed.
all of a sudden we not attorney. So much respect to that. Much respect for you being a part of the change agents that are so needed at this time of change. But can you just bring us full circle on what has happened in the last 24 hours behind the scenes, your involvement, and just because we need to know. So here on Rolling Out News, we want our community to know what has transpired in the last 24 hours in Minneapolis.
Okay, so how I found out about this incident was Ashley Quinones. She's a young woman in the Twin Cities whose husband, Brian Quinones, was shot and killed by Richfield and Edina police last year. And so that tragic incident brought Ashley to the front lines in terms of active. And she found out through friends that police had killed someone. And she posted it on Facebook and tagged me and some other people. And I was shocked I hadn't heard anything about this. Didn't see anything in the media, nothing. So I texted the chief to ask him, was someone killed? And he called me back and he said yes. And I said, well, what were the circumstances? Because what the people are saying on social media is that the police were involved in crushing his throat, either through choking him or stomping his throat or something. They aren't clear on what happened with his throat, but something happened that caused him to stop breathing. And so the chief at the time had been given information, I guess, from his officers that it was a medical incident that led to George Floyd dying, not excessive force. And the chief hadn't looked at any video footage or anything. And so, Eli Darris went to the scene, interviewed witnesses, and then he called me and he told me what the witnesses said. And so then within the hour, and I was on social media all this time posting, giving people updates. And then within the hour, the chief messaged me to say, here's our press release. And it was probably midnight. I read the press release and I said to the chief, this contradicts those witness statements that Eli heard. If you can get your hands on some footage, I would recommend looking as soon as possible to see what really happened. And maybe about 20, 30 minutes later, Ashley tagged me in a post of witness video footage showing what the officers really did. And I texted the chief and I said, they killed that man. And then, the chief and I had some conversations, and then we talked about a meeting that would happen today at 10 o'clock where he was inviting African-American leaders to come and converse with him about the incident. We talked about, what needed to happen. And then, we pretty much spent almost the full day with the chief. We were done meeting with him. We started at 10. We had a little bit of a break in between for maybe a couple hours. And then we wrapped up at 3 o'clock. And this was like a room full of maybe 15 to 20 African-American leaders in various degrees of leadership within, the city. And then ultimately we decided on a press conference, and we didn't know what the chief's decision was going to be until he spoke at the press conference and said that essentially he was firing all 4 officers. And the way he said it was former police officers of the department. So that's how we knew that they were done. And we applauded that decision. It was the right decision. It needed to happen. It was a strong show of leadership. And the mayor also supported that decision publicly as well, which makes a difference. We're not out of the woods because we know the chief is going to come under attack. Like I said, we know they're probably the decision. We know the county attorney is going to try not to hold them accountable. There's also, the chief also called in the FBI to investigate whether or not there was a violation of civil rights that happened under color of law. And the chief also called in the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which in my opinion is not a credible organization to investigate police. And I let them know that today as well during that meeting.
Okay, so for people who don't know, this is a state agency, correct?
Yes, it's a state agency. And they're not really, their design was not about investigating police homicide. They do a whole bunch of other stuff, but They contract with departments. They're not the only agency that can investigate, police shootings. They're the one that people most often go to. And after Jamar Clark was killed, we were fed up. We're like, we don't want MPD investigating itself after they kill someone, because that's what they would routinely do. We said we want an independent third-party investigation. And instead of the mayor doing that, she went to the BCA. We're like, these are cops protecting cops. And that's exactly what happened in that investigation and everyone since then. So we don't trust them, and we let them know that.
So you feel better about the U.S. Department of Justice getting involved?
No, I don't. And we let them know that too. So, because we had the Department of Justice involved after Jamar Clark was killed, and they rubber stamped the shooting.
Okay, I understand that. And then, but what the video of the live video showing, Mr. Ernest Comer, does that make it feel, does that put you in an optimistic mindset that something's going to move forward from a prosecution standpoint of these 4 officers?
No, not necessarily. There are too many examples of situations where, what appears to be clear to our community and what appears to be clear to even some people who are in positions of authority to make those decisions doesn't come out to be the circumstance that, whatever deciding authority, puts forward. So, while the footage exists, and while the decision to fire has been made, I remain sadly pessimistic. I wish I could say cautiously optimistic. Certainly would be a better circumstance. Unfortunately, not the case at this time. But what that allows for is continued energy, continued sense of urgency to push and drive and make sure that voices are heard, to make sure that the right decisions are being made as we move forward.
And I understand your position, going all the way back to Rodney King. You think that nobody can get exonerated after seeing that video and what happened. So I understand people need to be, not just up on, the time of the events of the day, but also they need to be well versed in recent history, not just even distant history, about how these things kind of play out and how things have been in the past and how they racial in proportions to today. So I understand your position, sir.
Certainly. Thank you, brothers, for the invitation to participate in this conversation, man. This is very, very important. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. Please continue to push the narrative and make sure that folks understand what's happening.
With you soon, Ernest. We appreciate you and all the members of the community. We respect your generation being a part. We definitely know and don't want to rob any of those who are in the room currently making that transition to improve the community. So thank you. Your voice is heard, but continue to be heard, Ernest, and we'll continue to report on this. Live from Minneapolis, we are Rolling Out News. Thank you for tuning in to everybody on Facebook. Thank you for your comments, but let's all continue to advocate for change and to continue this investigation in the George Floyd case in Minneapolis. Thanks, Sarah Shropshire. I'm Munson Steed. We're out of here. Thank you so much. We're Rolling Out News tonight.
All right, take care.